Judging by appearances never works out well, but people insist on doing it, and this time the consequence was almost fatal. But first, subscribe to the channel to follow exciting stories every day. The day when judging by appearances almost became a crime. Everyone thinks they can identify a problem at first glance. Just a wrong outfit, a tired demeanor, a detail out of the ordinary, and that's it. The invisible tribunal of society has already struck down the verdict. No explanation needed, no context needed, no history needed. It's the fastest judgment in the world, made by people who consider themselves too polite to admit they are prejudiced. This story begins exactly like this, with people who believed they were merely maintaining the norm, when in reality they were playing with something far more dangerous than they imagined. Because on that rainy night, while some customers sheltered from the cold with expensive wine, fine meats, and shallow conversations about business, a man entered seeking only to protect himself from the rain and hunger. He didn't enter asking for attention. He didn't enter begging for anything. He entered as someone who had already learned through life that the less one stands out, the less likely one is to be attacked. The problem is that, in certain environments, even trying to go unnoticed becomes provocation. The restaurant seemed elegant at first glance, but it carried that hidden weariness of places that were once important, and now survive more on appearance than essence. The lights were warm, the tables well set, the menu expensive, but there was something wrong in the air. And it wasn't the rain hitting the window. It was that silent tension that arises when someone out of place enters the scene and forces everyone to confront a discomfort they would rather ignore. The mistake began there, the moment some people decided that that man wasn't a customer, wasn't someone with rights, wasn't someone worthy of respect. To certain eyes, he became just a wet nuisance disrupting the scene. And when that kind of thinking meets someone with a little power and no empathy, the result is rarely just embarrassment. Sometimes it turns into abuse. Sometimes it turns into a crime. And sometimes, as in this story, it turns into a public fall that's hard to forget. But this isn't just a story about money, status, or a man who seemed out of place. This is a story about decisions made in seconds, about the weight of silence, and about an ordinary woman trapped in a grueling routine, who had little time to choose between obeying unjust orders or listening to her own conscience. Because while some use the little power they have to humiliate, others discover that a simple gesture, almost invisible, can change the destiny of many people that very night. When appearances become a judgment before the first word is spoken, the restaurant's heavy door opened with a slow, almost dramatic creak, as if announcing that something off-script was about to happen. Along with it came the cold wind, the smell of wet street, and a man who seemed to carry more stories on his body than dry clothes. His mud-stained boots touched the polished floor, creating an unsettling contrast for someone who believed elegance begins with the shoes. He paused for a second, not out of shame, but to get his bearings, like someone measuring the ground before stepping, a habit of someone who has learned that beautiful environments can also be hostile. The room reacted like a living organism. Conversations thinned out, cutlery slowed down, laughter died halfway through. Not because the man had done anything wrong, but because his presence shattered the carefully constructed illusion within. It was like a stain of reality on a decorative painting. Some people looked away, others glanced too quickly, trying to decide if it was a problem someone would solve soon or an inconvenience they would have to tolerate for a few minutes. The man walked to a table further away, near the kitchen entrance, and sat down. He didn't ask permission. He didn't ask permission to exist. He simply occupied the space as any customer would. A simple, almost naive gesture, but enough to trigger the invisible alarm of prejudice. In places like that, sitting down without being invited is almost a political act, and he knew it. Even so, he chose to stay. There was something about him that didn't match the hasty judgment. His tired body said one thing, but his attentive gaze said another. He observed too much, listened too much, seemed to absorb details that most there ignored. It wasn't the lost look of someone used to being expelled. It was the look of someone who understands the environment, measures risks, and awaits the next move. Even so, for those who had already decided to despise him, no nuance mattered. And it was in that uncomfortable silence, fueled by sideways glances and fragile certainties, that the mistake began to take shape. Because when someone is treated as if they don't even have the right to sit down, the next step is rarely polite. Someone always feels authorized to act. And in that room, amidst expensive glasses and inflated egos, there were already those ready to turn that rainmaker into the perfect target for an example. When petty power meets great arrogance. The manager emerged from the kitchen as if entering the stage knowing everyone would stare, not because he was important but because he liked to appear so. His suit was too tight for his body and too loose for his character, his shoes shining brighter than any empathy, and his face bore the classic expression of someone who confuses position with authority. He didn't ask if the man needed anything, didn't offer help, didn't make the slightest effort to appear polite. He had already decided the role each person there would play that night, and the wet man's role didn't include dignity. The voice was loud, calculated, designed to echo in the room and reach more people than necessary. It wasn't a conversation, it was a public warning, a message for the right customers, the ones who mattered, and for the employees who lived under the unwritten rule of fear. The manager spoke as if he were defending the restaurant, but in reality he was only defending his own sense of control. For him, that man wasn't a customer. He was an aesthetic affront, a flaw in the setting that needed to be corrected quickly. The curious thing is that the manager seemed more bothered than anyone else. While some customers merely observed, he moved with the urgency of someone who fears losing control. People like that can't stand the unpredictable. They need to classify, label, put everyone in their place, preferably below. And when the man responded calmly, without raising his voice, something cracked inside. Because there's nothing more irritating to an authoritarian than someone who doesn't react as expected. The man's calmness was interpreted as a challenge, not because he had said anything offensive, but because he showed no fear. He didn't beg. He didn't back down. He simply stated that he was a customer and that he wanted to eat. Simple, direct, polite. This type of response dismantles those who depend on shouting to feel in control. The manager took a step forward, invading the space, as if physical proximity could replace reason. It was the theater of power in its most primitive form. It was there that the manager decided that simply firing someone wasn't enough. He needed to humiliate them, to turn the situation into an example, to teach the employees the price of disobedience and the customers how much power he had. He didn't know it yet, but at that exact moment he had crossed an invisible line. Because humiliating someone based on appearance isn't just a lack of character. It's the kind of mistake that usually exacts high interest, and the bill, as always, arrives when you least expect it. When fear weighs more than the tray, Ana Clara watched the scene like someone recognizing a movie she'd seen too many times, only with a bad ending. She didn't need to hear the manager to know what was coming next. Her body knew before her mind. Her lower back stiffened, her jaw clenched, and that old weariness, not from a long shift, but from years of swallowing insults, rose like a bitter taste in her mouth. Working there had never been easy, but some days it felt heavier than carrying trays. It felt like carrying other people's humiliations as if they were part of the uniform. She knew every gesture of the manager, every calculated pause, every threat wrapped in a work order. She knew that this type of man didn't shout because he needed to. He shouted because he could. And she also knew that his power worked best when he found silence. The problem is that silence has a cost, and that night the cost seemed too high. Ana Clara needed that job. She needed the salary, the health insurance, the fragile stability that held an entire family together by a thread. Conscience, in that place, was an expensive luxury. When the man ordered the most expensive dish on the menu, she felt the blow before she saw his reaction. Not because it was absurd for someone to order food in a restaurant, but because she knew what it meant in that context. It was like lighting a match near a gas leak. The manager smiled in that specific way, the smile of someone who had just found justification for doing something wrong while feeling right. And Ana Clara understood. It was no longer about serving a customer, it was about punishing someone who dared not fit in. She tried to intervene as best she could, carefully, with measured words. Not because she agreed, but because she knew the terrain. People like that manager don't listen to arguments, they listen to weakness. And any sign of opposition becomes ammunition. He brought up her brother, her delayed college studies, her accumulated bills. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, a cruel reminder that no one there had the right to be fair if they wanted to keep their job. Still, something began to stir within Ana Clara. It wasn't sudden courage or a heroic speech. It was weariness. It was that moment when fear ceases to protect and begins to suffocate. She looked at the man sitting alone, too polite for someone being treated as a mistake, and realized that there were situations where obedience isn't neutrality. It's participation. And this silent, unsettling realization was the beginning of the decision that would change everything. Where wrong decisions gain a smell and consequences. The kitchen lacked the glamour of the dining room and the comfort of the well-set tables. The air there was heavy, hot, saturated with grease and pressure. It was a corridor of steel, steam, and metallic noises, where mistakes didn't stay hidden for long. When the order arrived, it didn't come alone. It was accompanied by tense glances, an awkward silence among the pots and pans, and a collective feeling that something wasn't right. The most expensive dish on the menu, for the most undesirable customer of the night. It was the kind of combination that only ends badly. The cook knew. He didn't need a manual, warning, or training to understand that there were limits. Every serious kitchen has invisible rules that aren't broken, not out of high morals, but for basic survival. Food that's not up to standard isn't just carelessness, it's a risk. And risk, in that environment, doesn't translate into a polite complaint. It leads to a hospital visit, a police report, headline news. Even so, the manager appeared as if bringing a solution, when in reality he brought an even bigger problem. The suggestion came disguised as an order. Nothing explicit, nothing recorded. Just that low, venomous tone of someone who feels secure enough to overstep boundaries because they believe no one will report them. To use what shouldn't be used. To take advantage of what was there without being missed. To save precisely where one cannot save. The manager wasn't talking about meat. He was talking about control. He was talking about showing that he could. Ana Clara felt her stomach churn. The smell wasn't right. The context wasn't right. The haste wasn't right. Everything about that decision screamed danger, but the scream was muffled by fear. She tried to argue, tried to warn, tried to appeal to the obvious. She was cut off, ordered back to the salon. The message was clear. Those who overthink lose their jobs. Those who obey survive, at least for now. As the dish began to be assembled, beautiful, well-seasoned, visually perfect, Ana Clara had the bitter feeling of watching a mistake being wrapped up like a gift. Every meticulous detail only made the situation more cruel. This was no longer a social humiliation. It was a real trap, and she knew. If that dish reached the table and was eaten, there would be no way to pretend it was just a misunderstanding. Few words, too great a risk. Ana Clara didn't think about heroism. She thought about time. She thought about probabilities. She thought about that fine line between doing something and being stopped before she could finish. In environments dominated by fear, Decisions aren't made in speeches. They're made in stolen seconds. The manager observed the room like a bored inspector, and the cameras seemed like eyes without eyelids. There was no room for confrontation, nor for a loud explanation. What there was a tiny window, the size of a sigh, and she decided to walk through it. She picked up an ordinary napkin, the kind no one notices, as if choosing precisely the most invisible object on the table. The pen came out of her apron pocket with an automatic gesture, honed by years of quick note-taking. The words came short, direct, without metaphor, without embellishment. It wasn't a time for poetry. It was a time for clarity. A bare, almost harsh warning, written with the urgency of someone who knows that any flourish could cost seconds, and seconds there mattered. She folded the paper with excessive care, not out of whim, but out of nervousness. The dish was ready. Too beautiful to be safe. The contrast was cruel. Impeccable appearance hiding a serious mistake, like certain people who present themselves well while doing indefensible things. Ana Clara felt her heart race with each step to the table. Every meter seemed like a test. Every glance, a potential obstacle. The room continued pretending to be normal, as if nothing was about to happen. As she placed the plate, she made the simplest and most dangerous gesture of the night. She slid the napkin alongside the cutlery, as if adjusting something out of habit. A quick touch. A firm look. Not a word out of order. If anyone noticed, it would be too late to explain. The man picked up the paper slowly, as if understanding that certain messages shouldn't be read with anxiety. And when he read it, something shifted inside him. It wasn't panic. It wasn't anger. It was focus. His posture straightened. His gaze became cold and attentive, like that of someone who had just confirmed a long-held suspicion. He didn't react immediately, didn't draw attention, didn't raise his voice. He simply understood exactly where he was and who he was dealing with. Ana Clara stepped back with a heavy heart, unsure if she had just saved someone or if she had just crossed a point of no return. But one thing she knew: that note had fallen into the right hands. When the game changes without warning. The man remained seated for a few seconds after reading the note, long enough for any inattentive observer to think nothing had happened. But Ana Clara noticed. It wasn't a sudden movement, nor a theatrical gesture. It was something more dangerous: absolute calm. His spine straightened as if an invisible piece had snapped into place, and his gaze lost any trace of fatigue. It was the kind of change that doesn't immediately attract attention, but transforms the entire atmosphere when it's finally noticed. He picked up the cutlery, sliced the meat with surgical precision, and brought the piece close to his mouth. Not to eat, but to test his limits. He paused mid-swing, as if holding time between two fingers. Instead of tasting, he carefully set down his fork and took a long sip of coffee, looking around with methodical attention. There was no hurry. People who are in control are rarely in a hurry. Haste is usually reserved for those about to make another mistake. That's when he pulled a cell phone from his pocket that didn't match the rest of the scene at all. It wasn't new for show, but for efficiency. The kind of device for someone who solves problems, not someone who posts photos. The manager noticed immediately. The change in the object shattered the illusion he had built. That small bright screen looked like a crack in the mirror where he saw himself as powerful. He approached too quickly, trying to regain control with improvised rules and an authoritarian tone. "This isn't the place for phone calls," he said, more nervous than he cared to admit. The man didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood up. And there, standing, he occupied the space in a way that no one else could ignore. It wasn't physical height. It was presence. It was the quiet confidence of someone who doesn't need to prove anything. He asked to speak to the manager. Not sarcastically, not threateningly. He asked as someone who already knows the answer, but needs everyone to hear it. The room felt heavy, as if the air had thickened. The manager tried to laugh, tried to mock, tried to pretend he was still in charge. But the laugh came out crooked, short, empty. When the phone was put on speakerphone, silence became the rule. A voice on the other end answered with immediate respect, calling the man by name. There was no dramatic announcement, no background music, just reality imposing itself with the force of something that cannot be denied. At that moment, the manager understood that he wasn't dealing with a problem customer, but with someone who could dismantle everything in there without raising an eyebrow. And Ana Clara, observing from afar, realized that the tables had turned, not with shouting, but with real authority, the kind that appears when abuse reaches its limit. When abuse finds witnesses. The change in atmosphere was immediate, almost physical. The room that had previously seemed comfortable now had the weight of an improvised interrogation room. No one spoke loudly, no one moved without thinking twice. The manager, who minutes before had been walking with a puffed-up demeanor, began to sweat in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. The power he wielded there only worked as long as no one confronted him. The moment someone didn't bow down, the entire structure began to creak. The man didn't need to raise his voice to take control. He calmly demanded explanations, as someone who already knew the answers but wanted to hear the lie before debunking it. Each question seemed too simple to cause panic, but that was precisely what made it all the more cruel. There was no room for improvisation, no space for the manager to invent heroic versions. The silence between questions was more awkward than any shouting. When the kitchen was called into the dining room, the discomfort turned into open tension. The cook entered with short steps, restless hands, and downcast eyes. He wasn't a villain. He was someone crushed by orders he hadn't dared to defy. The truth came out in pieces, between pauses and desperate glances at the manager, as if still hoping for some salvation. But there was no more protection there. The game of threats was over. The manager tried to react in the only way he knew how, by accusing. He pointed at Ana Clara, distorted facts, tried to shift the blame onto someone he always believed no one would listen to. It was a classic mistake, because people used to giving orders forget that evidence doesn't get intimidated. The note appeared. Simple, crumpled, clear handwriting. A piece of paper too small to carry so much weight, and too powerful to be ignored. At that moment, the downfall ceased to be merely professional and became public. The manager lost his composure, his tone. He lost control. The authority he believed he possessed evaporated in the face of witnesses, documents, and decisions that no longer depended on his will. The abuse, which had always operated hidden behind positions and fear, had finally been exposed to the light. And when that happens, no amount of talk can save it. All that's left is to fall. After the chaos comes the weight of what changes. When the noise subsided and the doors finally closed, there was no sense of victory left. There was no applause, no feeling of an instant happy ending. What remained was that heavy silence that only appears after a mess too big to ignore. The kind of silence that forces everyone to face what happened, without pretense. The restaurant, once a stage for arrogance, seemed smaller. Not physically, but morally. As if the walls had heard too much and were now observing in judgment. Ana Clara sat for a few minutes, unsure of exactly what to feel. Her body trembled, not from immediate fear, but from the delayed adrenaline rush. Doing the right thing hadn't been pretty, comfortable, or heroic. It had been exhausting, risky, and lonely. She hadn't saved the day. She had only prevented something far worse. And that difference weighs heavily. Because preventing tragedies rarely earns medals. It earns responsibility. The decision came without ceremony, not as a reward, but as a logical consequence. Change of position, new role, new expectations. The promotion didn't sound like a triumph, but like a silent warning. Now the weight was hers. Managing people, correcting mistakes, rebuilding trust. This wasn't a wrapped gift. It was an open box full of real problems, the kind that don't appear in motivational speeches. The restaurant also went on hiatus. Doors closed, lights off, process review, forced training. It was like a wounded organism trying to heal itself without pretending nothing had happened. Some employees breathed a sigh of relief. Others were suspicious. Real change is often more frightening than predictable abuse. Ana Clara realized this quickly. Leading wouldn't be about being liked. It would be about being fair, and fairness almost never pleases everyone. At the end of that day, when she went out into the street, still damp from the earlier rain, she realized that life hadn't become lighter. It had become more real. The fear hadn't disappeared, only shifted. But there was something new there, something firm. The certainty that she hadn't lost herself in order to keep her job. And that, in a world where many people sell themselves cheaply to survive, was a silent form of victory. When character is revealed, everything else loses its mask. Ultimately, that night wasn't marked by the dish that wasn't eaten, nor by the scandal that spread through the dining room. It was marked by what was revealed without announcement, without a show, without background music. It became clear who was using their position as a shield for their own cowardice, and who, even without any power, was able to act when no one else wanted to get involved. The restaurant remained there, the tables remained the same, but something invisible had changed forever. The Rain Man left the place quietly, without needing to explain anything to anyone. He didn't need to. He had already seen enough. The one who entered there in disguise wasn't a millionaire. It was someone trying to understand if it was still worth trusting people. And, ironically, he found the answer not in those who shouted the loudest, but in those who carried trays, backaches, and difficult decisions in their apron pockets. Sometimes the greatest authority isn't at the top, but in the midst of the chaos, doing what needs to be done. Ana Clara returned home that night different. Not lighter, not richer, not safer. Different. With that strange feeling of someone who knows they've crossed a point of no return. Because after you choose not to be complicit, you can't pretend anymore. She didn't become a heroine. She became a role model. And that weighs heavily. It weighs more than the old fear, because now her choices affected not only her own life, but the entire environment around her. The manager, on the other hand, discovered too late that humiliating someone is easy when no one is watching. The hard part is maintaining the facade when the truth comes out. The small amount of power he used as a weapon couldn't withstand a single correct decision made in silence. It wasn't revenge. It was a consequence. And consequences don't shout, don't explain themselves, don't apologize. They simply arrive. And perhaps that's the most uncomfortable part of this story. It doesn't talk about rare exceptions. It talks about common situations. It talks about how many times someone is judged by their appearance, discarded without a chance to defend themselves, silenced by fear. And how, sometimes, all that separates abuse from a turnaround is a simple gesture made at the right time. If this story made you think, leave a like, share it with someone who needs to hear this today, and comment below. Would you have had the courage to do the same in her place?